Like most adolescent boys, I'm sure I had a more than usually interest in sex, but why you choose to make a career out of it, you'd have to say is a trifle odd. So I'm sure everybody else has their own particular journey in terms of why they wound up doing what we do. I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour of mine, but also focus on how ASSERT developed. And believe me, it was a bumpy ride a lot of the way, but we're here still 36 years on. I've got some copies of my original history of ASSERT here if anybody wants them, but I've been told by Matty I'm not allowed to hand them out because she wants you all to go to the website and read it there. Talking about mentors, I've had some important sexual mentors in my life, and I've tried to be something of a mentor to some of the people who've come through since. But it all started for me as a medical student in 1970. And I was doing my obstetrics and gynecology in my medical school in London, which is where I trained. And we got hold of a book written by a gynecologist called Derek Llewellyn-Jones. Now, Derek was trained at Trinity College, Dublin. He spent many years working from Kuala Lumpur with his wife, Elizabeth Kirby, who was an actor. And he finally wound up in Sydney and became quite an icon in terms of, not only in terms of formulating the future of gynecology in this city and this country, but also for medical students. And he wrote this book on gynecology for medical students, which is still out there. And it was revolutionary. Every gynecological textbook up to that point for medical students had been about plumbing. All about hysterectomies and what female organs did, but nothing about women. And where Derek was different was that he looked at women holistically. He embraced women and not just their genital organs. So that for us was revolutionary. And we were a group of medical students who'd been to another university. We came in the first group who arrived with long hair and slightly different attitudes. Early in 1977, I decided that sexuality interested me. And Eric Fisher, who was another person I had high regard for, ran a course for the Australian College of GPs on human sexuality. After that, as it happened, and this is where the serendipity sets in, a very close friend of mine was dating a very nice young lady called Jenny Richardson, who was Derek Richardson's older daughter. And when she met me, she said, "Oh, you better meet Daddy," because Daddy's a full-time sex therapist in Sydney. And I met Derek, and he said, "We're having a meeting because a group of us want to set up a sexuality organisation. We don't have any GPs around, so you better come along." So I went along to what was that first meeting at Pre-Term in Surrey Hills, not very far from here. And believe it or not, I have a very vivid memory of that meeting because we were all crammed into this tiny meeting room. And I was meeting people and with people who I would obviously spend quite a long journey with. And I still have a very vivid memory of it. In the room were Derek Richardson, Derek Llewellyn-Jones, Warwick Williams, Greta Goldberg, who convened the meeting, Norman Rees, Bettina Arndt, Eric Fisher, Ron Farmer, who was quite well known in the psychology world at that time, Jules Black, and there may have been others there who I've omitted to mention, but it was quite a formative meeting. From that moment on, ASSERT was born, and with great enthusiasm, every month we had meetings at Pre-Term, and the numbers never dropped below 60 people per meeting, sometimes more than that. It was a vibrant thing, and everybody wanted to come. And half the people who came, we didn't know who they were there. They turned up with their recorders, and they were recording the meetings. They're obviously very enthusiastic. And at some point we said, well, let's do some experiential work, so that'll get rid of some of them, which of course we did. And so a few of them left very rapidly. Well, we had a hardcore meeting who turned up. And I was very involved over the many years of ASSERT, running meetings, everything from transsexuals to bisexuals to anything else you can mention. And it was a very formative, because that was my office, my learning. That's where I learned. I'm having monthly meetings with people who knew what they were talking about, and that was my sex education. There was a lot of interest from other states, particularly from Victoria, who were going through a very tough time with their Psychological Practices Act. As far as people in Victoria were concerned, sex was the dark art. And Dallas Sargent, who may or may not, these are names, I'm sorry, it might mean anything to some of you, who was a very formative figure in psychology in in Melbourne, and people like Lorraine Denniston and Elsie Cardlow. And they were really interested in what we were doing because they wanted to come on board. There was also some interest from Dr. Gwen Leavesley, who subsequently was the president of ASSERT from Western Australia. We had our first conference, and believe it or not, I have a bit of a printout of that, which was held on the 21st of November 1980 in what was the Embassy Motel Deakin in Canberra, referred to as the Deakin Inn. And given two of our keynote speakers were Julia Hyman, who co-authored Becoming Orgasmic with Joe LaPiccolo, and Chris Titsey, both from America. The die was set. I don't know who invited them, but it sure as hell was interesting. Now, I don't have many memories of that meeting, other than there was an amazing vibe. There was just this energy, because all the Victorians came because they wanted to be part of it, and there was just all these people there who were part of the vibe. But the one thing I do remember was Friday evening. Now, for those of you who didn't know, Jules Black loves to shock. And the program for Friday evening read, welcome reception, cocktails and smorgasbord dinner. Film, audio-visual material to be announced, introduction, Dr. Jules Black. Well, we all got out of a very nice dinner feeling quite relaxed. And Jules put up this video of a man masturbating. Now, the poor guy obviously had retarded ejaculation because he went on and on and on and on. Now, yours truly, being involved with running the conference, was sitting at the back, and I have to admit, I fell asleep. The only honest response was from some reporter from a newspaper in Canberra, some young lady who sat in the front row, who said she admitted that she was quite turned on by this. Now, I remember absolutely nothing else about that conference, but that's, for the record, that was the first ASSERT conference. Subsequent to that, and I'll just run through a little bit of history, the plan was to make ASSERT national. It's important to know that ASSERT started as ASSECT, A-A-S-E-C-T, which was too close to the American Australian Association of Sex Educators, Counsellors and Therapists. They objected. So with great foresight, we went to ASSERT, A-A-S-E-R-T, Australian Association of Sex Educators, Associations and Therapists. And then the group of the meeting said, well, why don't we go one step further and make it ASSERT, which is a much better acronym because it actually means something. All right? So that's how we evolved to ASSERT. When we went national, there was a lot of politics involved. And for those of you who've seen us go back to being a state-run entity again, I guess you understand that. And we were nervous in New South Wales that Victoria was so enthusiastic that if we gave them the presidency, which was planned to rotate, that they would basically run their own agenda, which was very different to what we wanted in New South Wales. So we decided to flick it to Western Australia, to Gwen Leavesley, and the next conference that we had was in WA. But as it happened, the forces that were going to disrupt the organisation were already at work, and within 2 years, ASSERT went back to being separate, autonomous state bodies. That was bad for ASSERT, because a lot of people had wanted ASSERT to go somewhere, and people just left the membership in droves. It was like, you know, the goal had gone, the star had gone, and we lost our way. And so a lot of people stopped turning up to meetings, and you could see ASSERT was going into a decline. The next pivotal point was in November 1985, when Jules Black and I went to the Delhi conference of WAS to pitch for the World Congress in Sydney. And we were very much outmaneuvered by a very powerful group from Venezuela, so it went to Caracas. Jules was then the current president of ASSERT and took it very personally because he was the Secretary General of WAS at the time. And when he came back to Sydney, he was sufficiently upset to resign the presidency before the end of his term. So yours truly found himself at that point president of ASSERT. Subsequent to me, if Rosie will remember, it was Terry Colling followed me, and then Rosie. Is that correct? I'm not sure Rosie will put us in that way. I've just come up with a few highlights of the journey with ASSERT. It's been a bumpy ride some of the time, but there were certainly a lot of highlights. In 1983, from then on, pretty much as initially as treasurer of ASSERT, and with dwindling finances, the whole of ASSERT was run through my practice in Coogee. About a month later, my phones were jammed because they'd released a sealed section on the G-spot. And every woman in Australia was looking for her G-spot and was ringing my surgery to find out where she could find it. Now, of course, my staff were completely befuddled by this, and they got to the point where one of them would say, look, I think Wendy's found her G-spot, I'll put you onto her. But eventually, we managed to spread the load around all the other therapists who were registered with ASSERT, but inevitably some of them wound up on my doorstep. And I can remember it was a Monday afternoon, as clear as yesterday. And as the card was handed over the desk, my staff was like, G-spot, you know. So this first girl comes in, she sits down, because I'm being terribly laid back. I said, what can we do for you? And she said, well, I came about my G-spot, but I think I've changed my mind. Then the second one came in, and I explained in fairly good detail as to where she might find her G-spot, whereupon she said, well, can you show me? At this point, ethical considerations took over, and I politely declined, but that wasn't what I did. And then the third girl came in, who was quite young. I think she was about 16 or 17 years old. And she sits down, and I take a history from her, and she goes in fairly graphic details about her sex life with her boyfriend. So after she finished, I said, well, you know, it seems like you're having a really good time. Why do you want to find your G-spot? And she said, well, because I found his. Now, for those of you who don't know, there is some, you know, the G-spot is supposed to be a residual prostate organ, but there's another story. That by hangs another story. I've rambled on for long enough. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Martin. And I found that fascinating. A lot of that, most of it I didn't know, and I'm sure most people here didn't. So for us, it was really fantastic to hear. And just to remind you.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's a very special evening, and the way I'm going to talk is about the history of the Australian Centre for Sexual Health, where I began my career, and how it all morphed together with what we see today. And I currently work at Sydney Men's Health in Bondi Junction. And just a little bit of a summary about this is sort of the milestones, and we all know the beginning of sexual medicine was with Alfred Kinsey and then Masters and Johnson. You just saw recently that Virginia Johnson died. There was quite a few eulogies in the Herald about her. They divorced, I think, in 1998, but she continued working in and he died in the early 2000s. Sorry, Martin. And then the ASSERT started. When I was a GP, I sent my patients with sexual dysfunction to him because I didn't know anything about it. And he was very unusual. He had special, paper with blue lines around it, and he wrote about 3 or 4 pages of stuff that I was quite embarrassed by. He had every detail, and he was a very perfectionist, and apparently his secretary had to retype all these letters many times. He was a bit OCD in that regard. But he was certainly my guru, and he was the first person I had any contact with about this area. And then in 1991, Philip Stricker rang me and said, look, I'm setting up this clinic. I need a GP, would you like to join? And little did I know what I was getting myself into, but I was sort of getting a bit burnt out in general practice, and I just felt it sounded interesting because he said to me, like, you send me a lot of patients with prostate problems and bladder problems and stuff, and Phil was already doing a bit of ED stuff then, and I can see you've got a good, you work well with it, come and join us. So that all started, and I'll show you a picture of the opening in a moment. In 1992, in February, the Australian Centre for Sexual Health opened in St Luke's Hospital. The other milestones about my career was when Viagra was launched in 1998. That was really an absolutely major thing because Pfizer was very generous in those days, and the amount of functions and the promotions, it was just unbelievable, and trips and all the stuff we used to get in those days was truly outstanding. That's all changed, by the way. It's all stopped now. Then as a result of Viagra being launched, in 1999 or 98 or 99, around that time, Pfizer wanted to have an independent organisation to to promote sexual health, but for the public and for doctors. And Impotence Australia was commenced, and that's when I met Brett. And at that stage, I was president of Impotence Australia. And that's went through a few stages, and it's now currently in Goulburn Street. And then the next big milestone was the launch of Levitra and Cialis in 2003. That was not such an enormous thing like Viagra, but it was still pretty important because we now had 3 medications. And then this is sort of the chronology of what I've been through. Now, the Australian Centre for Sexual Health placed in the nurses' home, the old nurses' home at St Luke's Hospital, because as you know, nurses no longer live in hospitals, but when we were all students, they had huge accommodations that they had to live in. And so that building suddenly became vacant. Philip Stricker very cleverly got connected with the hospital because just in the late 80s, suddenly it was thought that all sexual dysfunction in men could be treated with surgery, vascular surgery. History tells us that failed, but St Luke's Hospital was very keen to fill its beds with all these erectile dysfunction patients who Philip was going to do operation on. And so they agreed with very generous terms to renovate a whole floor for us. And that was our very first office. It was in the library of that building. They really ripped it apart, and it's the beginning of cable. We actually had cabling for our computers, which is really, telephone-wise. It was the very beginning of all that time, and they spent a lot of money. That was our front desk, and that's Di. A very nice waiting room. I mean, it was really state-of-the-art, and lots of rooms, spacious rooms. It was lovely. This is the opening ceremony in February 1992. And that was our core group that started the whole thing going. That's 21 years ago. We started getting visitors from all over the world, but particularly Asia. There was all these Indian and Indonesian people. We got really well known. And Derek Richardson had this amazing idea, and he got the hospital to agree to it, to put in a viewing room for training students. It was a room where you sat outside with hearing things on. It was a very expensive setup with a viewing window. And when Derek Richardson, as you know, he was our amazing mentor, and he received an accolade from the College of GPs. He got an honorary fellowship. Philip Stricker really got into the vascular thing. They were visiting people to come watch him do this surgery. In fact, vascular surgery is coming back, by the way, but in a slightly different form. And Chris McMahon did the... He got cavernosography or cavernosometry going, and you can see his X-rays here. You can imagine what these pictures are of. That's it looks like a penis. It is. It is. We had a room downstairs where we could give lectures, and they had state-of-the-art equipment. The slide projectors. You remember the carousels that used to go around, and the slides used to get stuck in them. Yeah, we had all that. And look, we had an amazingly good team, a very strong team. It was a very good place for me to start working. Of course, over time, I got better at doing it, and sort of learned through my patience and my mistakes. And I also have to say, another mentor was Rosie, because Derek died very soon. He died in '95, and so. Really, Rosie took over from him, and without Rosie's encouragement and influence, I wouldn't have got where I was today. So thank you, Rosie. You were a very important part of my education in this area.
We all helped each other.
We did, we did. And there's Margaret Rellerman, another colleague of ours, and we still work together in Bondi Junction. I showed this picture because I actually liked the bow tie. Have you still got it? And there's Caroline. Do you remember that one, Caroline? No. And Di. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some memories from the days of the Australian Centre for Sexual Health. I arrived there between the 3rd and 4th years of my psychology degree that I was completing at the time. So I knew nothing about about the subject matter at all. I just knew that they needed a research assistant, and I got the job. On fairly flimsy grounds, but I got it. And then I learnt fast. So I learned about how to do clinical trials, and the first trial we did was something called delequamine. I went away to finish my honours year and then came back immediately to start the next drug trial, which was a drug called sildenafil. And I actually got to recruit the subjects, put them through, do all the preliminaries before they got to see the doctor. And then when they came on the trial, I was the person who handed out the pills, double-blind study, so we weren't supposed to know who got what. And I also had to learn to take blood and do ECGs. I realised pretty early on that these were historic times, that this was really a game changer, this trial that we were doing. It was a really interesting experience, and of course I got to understand what sexuality and the role of professionals in sexual health was all about. And as I was at the time undertaking my own psychotherapy training, this was all grist for the mill. Now, after we finished the male studies, there'd been enormous pressure. Well, what about the women? And they took it on, and Rosie was the chief investigator, and boy, was that a sharp learning curve. And I have to say how magnificent it was to share those times with Rosie, who people really didn't know much about how to do this and what was going to be the effect of this drug and how to design the protocol. And I remember going to Melbourne they put us up at the, gosh, you got some good times there. They put us up at the Como.
Yeah, it was nice.
It was very nice. And
we had separate rooms.
We did. Enormous rooms. It was all very lovely. And so, but we had a meeting and I sat beside you, Rosie, and you just told all these people, well, this is my model of female sexual response cycle, and you drew it. And I thought, I'm in the presence of greatness here. This is a really wonderful way to learn. Rosie occasionally sent us up the street to buy certain objects that had disappeared or be stolen. But I gradually acquired a knowledge and started to become interested in the whole world of sex therapy as a psychologist. All I want to say is that they were life-changing times for me. I feel really privileged to have been part of it, to have a glimpse into this world, and it had an enormous effect on my career. The mentoring that I received from these three people and how much I respect you and thank you, and the wonderful friends that you have been for me. So I wish ASSERT all the best. It's amazing. Thank you.
I just want to say that I never planned to become a sex therapist. Right, when I was a little girl, I didn't say, Mummy, when I grow up, I want to talk about sex all day. In fact, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a missionary. Right? So I suppose my gravestone, Ross, should say, she went from missionary to missionary position. But in mentioning my mother, I have to say that I owe her a great debt of gratitude because she was extremely open about sex. She was very comfortable, very relaxed, and she was an askable parent. You could ask my mother everything. And she always gave an answer, and if she didn't know, she said, I'll find out. But she gave me a comfort around sexuality that I've had my whole life. So that when I finished medicine and I was doing the family medicine program, I actually had met Martin socially before I went to work with him, so I knew what a hunk he was. And I was very fortunate to be invited to do 2 terms at his practice. And Martin was a doctor with a difference, right, because he did sex therapy. And I just knew that I had found something really special for myself. And he was a member of ASSERT, and I also joined ASSERT at that time. And I can remember going to meetings at preterm, and it was packed to the gunnels, and the enthusiasm, you could smell it in the air. It was just a fabulous, fabulous time. I like to talk to the patients, and I like to listen to them. And that's the best thing about being a sex therapist, is you have an hour with your patients. And I now work with my husband. He's my practice manager. And we have a little system. And he rings the telephone at the end of the hour. And I say to the patients, that's my husband telling me to stop talking. And the other day, a guy said, I wish I could do that to my wife. So then I went to work. I was in solo practice for a while, and then I went to work at the Australian Centre for Sexual Health, and you've heard a lot about that. And that was just a fabulous experience. And of course, working with Michael and working with Martin and the rest of the group, we fed each other. And it was a very energised and lively atmosphere to work in. And I did some wonderful research with Caroline. Caroline was just fabulous to work with. We did the first female trial in Viagra. And these women, all right, came to us, all right, and they entered into the trial, right, and they were terribly disappointed with the results. Now, men loved Viagra. Why? Because it gave them vasocongestion, which gave them an erection like this, all right? I've never had a woman come to see me and say, "Doctor, I'd like more vasocongestion," all right? And what these women wanted was more desire, more arousal, more pleasure, more satisfaction, more orgasms, and usually more foreplay, all right? And a pill isn't going to give you that. Now, just up the road from the clinic, because the clinic, it was in Potts Point, but it was actually in King's Cross, all right? There was a sex shop about 5 doors up the road. And one of the things that I used to do with my really uptight patients was to take them on a trip up to the sex shop, right? And so we'd go up there, and I had a woman, and I'd been coaching on it. I was saying, "I want you to ask for a vibrator," all right? And so we go in there, and she walks up to the gentleman behind the counter, and she says to him, "I would like to purchase a vibrator." And he said, "Madam, come this way." And she said, "If I could come that way, I wouldn't need a vibrator." Now, my career wasn't at all planned. I had so many wonderful opportunities that came my way, and I think that the secret to my success was that I'm just a girl who can't say no. All right? When somebody said, "Could you do talkback television, real time?" I said, "Yes, of course I can do that." When they said, "Can you write for a magazine?" I said, "Yes, I can do that." I said yes to corporate speaking engagements, and I've had some wonderful experiences. I've spoken to the Dairy Farmers Milk Co-op about sex, the Chartered Accountants of New South Wales. Obviously, sex is a universally popular topic. When my children were small, I was invited to tutor at the University of New South Wales, the medical students there. I really didn't know what I let myself in for. It was something called Introductory Clinical and Behavioural Sciences. I didn't even know what that was. I said yes. But as time went on, Martin and I, we had a 3-hour session on a Saturday morning, all right, for the students, and we were a terrific double act. And we gave them male sexuality and we gave them female sexuality. Now, things have changed since then, all right? That was the only sex education that the students got in their whole 5-year medical career, was 3 hours with us. Now, I do it with Michael, all right, and he gets 1 hour on male sexuality and I get 1 hour on female sexuality in first year, all right? These kids are probably all virgins, all right? Some of them don't even have pubic hair. So if you're expecting doctors to become better at talking about sex, don't hold your breath, because they're just not getting the education. People still recognise me today, and they will stop me in the street, and all they say to me, "I know you from somewhere. I know you. Did our children play soccer together? You know, are you in my bridge club?" All right, and I have to explain who I am. Actually, a woman came up. I flew up to Brisbane on the weekend to give a lecture, and a woman came up to me in the airport and said to me, "Didn't you used to be Dr. Rosie King?" Am I dead? Have I had a sex change? People often ask me what a sex therapist does, and I can remember when my youngest son, Steve, who's now 30, was in 2nd class at school. And I was doing a lot of work in the media in those days, and a lot of public speaking and a lot of teaching, and kind of my face seemed to be everywhere. And he came home from school one day, and he was only a little boy, and he was quite disgruntled. And I said to him, "Steve, what is the matter?" And he said, "Robbie's mother says that you get paid to talk dirty in public." And he said to me, "I thought you just talked about sex." So that was many years ago, and to this day I continue to talk dirty in public, and I hope to do so for many years to come. I have some advice for you all, and that is do as we have done and follow your dreams. Be positive, make plans for a rosy future. And I want you to be like the gentleman who came to see me in my rooms recently. He was 85 years old, and I said to him, do you have any further goals for your life? And he said, definitely. I'd like to be named in a fraternity suit when I'm 90. Now that's positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie, for those wonderful words.
I'd like to also congratulate Martin, Michael and Rosie on this award. Martin and Michael and Rosie have certainly been very important in my career development. They've shown that they're ethical, that they are prepared to sort of go out into society, talk about sex, be the front of the profession, which at times can be quite difficult, particularly in our political environment where we tend to go from being liberal to very conservative. And I won't be talking much more. I just now would invite Martin to come and receive his certificate and thank him very much for all his work in this field. Thank you very much, Martin. I'd like to now call Michael up to receive his certificate. And just add one thing, I'm really glad to be working with you now, Michael. I've tried for years to actually work with you. Thank you. Maddie will give you an award. Thank you, Michael.
I hope this is better than mine got from Europe.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's terrible. Thank you, Michael. There we go. And I'd like to invite Rosie up to receive her certificate and award as well. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you very much for all your help. Thank you.
Thank you very much.